Welcome back to another episode of the Discernible Interviews. Very, very excited to have back for the second time Professor Nikolai Petrovsky. The good professor is a professor from the College of Medicine and Public Health at Flinders University in the lovely town of Adelaide in South Australia. Nikolai's interests, his research focus has been on vaccine development, autoimmunity, and immunoinformatics. The really cool thing is, he is the founder of a company called Vaccine, Vaxine, who have created a number of products. I think in his career, he's brought 4 successful vaccine products to market through clinical trials. But right now, they have a COVID-19 vaccine called Covax-19. So in today's interview, we're going to do a follow-up on our interview about 6 months ago to find out where Covax is at, when we can all get it for those of us who want it. And we're also going to be talking about something he's been very vocal about, vaccine mandates, which are all the rage right now. Yes, I think that's it. Well, welcome to the show again, Professor.
It's a pleasure.
Let me start the interview this way. At the moment, Professor, we seem to be being told that there are 2 types of people in Australia. There's those who are willing to do the right thing and get the vaccine, and there are those who are very, very naughty and who won't get the vaccine. But I've discovered that there are a whole bunch of people who don't want this vaccine. There are a lot of people waiting for Covax-19. So can we start with maybe explain to me whether these people are crazy, like myself, or whether there are some valid reasons to be concerned about the current crop of vaccines, and whether is it a wise thing to be looking for an alternative like your protein vaccine?
Look, I think that's a really good question, and it goes to the issue of choice and perception of the risk-benefit of having not just any vaccine, but a particular vaccine, and whether you as an individual are entitled to make that choice, or can it be forced upon you, which has been argued is certainly against the Geneva Convention. You cannot force a treatment on any individual unless they're a threat to the community. So if they're carrying an infectious disease, and which is a lethal disease, and they're deliberately transmitting it to people, then at that point, the law is that you have a right to restrain them to protect other people. The law is very clear that you don't have a right to force someone to have a treatment they don't want if they're not a threat to others. And so I think that's the legal context in which we're discussing this. Now, in terms of people, being apprehensive about having the currently available vaccines in Australia, then, everyone has a right to an opinion, and they have a right to feel apprehensive if that's their assessment of the information that's available to them. Now, when we look at those vaccines, the simple answer is they haven't been around very long. I mean, no COVID vaccines have been around, longer than 18 months. But particularly the technologies that underpin those 2 vaccines, in fact, haven't been around more than 18 months, which is a very unusual situation. Typically, even though it takes a number of years to develop a vaccine, they're usually being based on platforms or systems of making a vaccine that in many cases have been around for decades, like our vaccine, or in the case of the inactivated vaccines, have been around for hundreds of years. And of course, that experience in billions of people over decades or up to hundreds of years provides a very high level of confidence that those technologies are extremely safe and effective. Now, you can't say that about a vaccine that has really never been used in large number of humans, except for the last 6 to 12 months. You simply cannot, say that with the same level of assurance. So So we can't lump all those vaccines in the same basket and say, oh, they're all the same. Right. You know, they've gone through the same approval process. The reality is we just don't know what the long-term consequences of those vaccines are. We hope that they're favourable, but can we give 100% certainty about that? Of course we can't. If we're being honest, we have to say there is an element of the unknown in terms of where those vaccines may look when we look back in 10 or 20 years' time. So people, as I say, some people will say, look, you know, maybe there's a risk of the unknown. I'm happy to take that on board. I think I want to have that vaccine to protect my health, and that's obviously a large number of people. Other people who are just more cautious by nature, you know, are going to look at it and say, I'm not convinced, you know, that risk, no matter how small, of, you know, something turning up in the future means that I want to wait and I want to use a different technology that, you know, has been around a long time, and I have more confidence. I think no one is wrong. Both people have a right to their opinion, and both are entitled to make their own choices.
But when you raised an important issue at the beginning about if there is a threat to others, then perhaps mandates might play a role. Isn't that the argument that we are being told now? Especially, I mean, I'm here in Melbourne. My lovely Premier is Mr. Daniel Andrews. The constant messaging is you must do this to protect yourself and to protect others. And it is selfish of you to not do that. So what's wrong with that messaging?
So the science is wrong, because the you know, that would only apply, one, if what you were potentially transmitting to others, you know, was, you know, a lethal and highly lethal disease. Say it was Ebola, where 90% of people who contract it are going to die, or HIV, which, you know, 100% of people who contract it are going to live with it for the rest of their lives. I mean, fortunately now we have treatments that in the old days, again, it was 100% lethal. So that is the first context. You know, the disease you're transmitting can't be flu. Like, we can't lock up someone who has flu because they have flu, because they're at risk of transmitting it to another person, because the risks from that, you know, transmission are very low. And so it's all relative again to risk. So that's the first principle, is what they're doing has to be a very high risk to others. You know, the risk of passing on COVID, you know, to an otherwise healthy person is actually very low, particularly if you're passing it on to a young person. Not to say it's a good thing to do, but we have to factor that risk in. But the most important thing, and where the science says that it's a completely flawed principle, is that having the current crop of vaccines does not guarantee that you won't get infected, and it doesn't guarantee that you won't transmit the virus to others. So if the vaccine can't stop that transmission, then it's a completely flawed argument that you're protecting other people by having the vaccine. The only person you're protecting is yourself, and that's really the justification for the vaccines, is that we know that if you've had one of the vaccines and you do get exposed, it won't stop you getting infected, but it does stop you then getting serious disease, and particularly the chance of you dying from that infection. So the vaccine is protecting the individual. There is no evidence whatsoever at this stage that COVID-19 vaccines are protecting the community, and that's where it's flawed. Unless you have that evidence that the vaccine is blocking transmission to everyone else, then it's a fallacy to imply that forcing you to get vaccinated is somehow beneficial to the community when there is no evidence for that.
Okay, so there seems to be studies popping up all the time around this thing on either side of the argument. What is the general layman public supposed to make of them? For example, one I saw popped up this morning, a study showing that transmission is lessened in a vaccinated cohort, And then, of course, people like Geert van den Bosch jumped on and said this is flawed reasoning and so on. But the layman sees that, and our politicians jump on that and say, Dan Andrews literally said this on the Today Show yesterday. Look, this proves that it does protect the community. So how are we to reconcile what you've just told me and what we're being told all the time, which is the vaccines do prevent transmission, or they're not sterilizing, but they do lessen transmission?
No, so I think and again, it all comes down to mathematics. If you're happy to go through a mathematics lesson, so it all comes down to the R0, the transmissibility of a virus.
Right.
And so if we have a virus that has an R0 that's just above 1, so, then we know that all we need to do is get the R0 below 1 and the virus will die out, right? Because it means that you have to have at least one person infected by each person who's infected for the virus to keep propagating.
Yes.
So certainly if COVID had an R0 of 1.2 and a vaccine even had a slightest impact on the risk of transmission, right, which there is, evidence that there's a very weak effect on transmission, then in fact, yes, it could have an impact. The problem we're dealing with is that Delta has an R0 that's somewhere between 6 and 8.
Wow.
So for every person infected, right, they're going to infect 6 to 8 other people. So a vaccine that reduces the transmissibility of the virus by, say, 20% is going to take that, R0 of 6, and it may get it down to 5. So now instead of a person infecting 6 people, they're going to infect 5 people. Well, exponential growth where each person's infecting 5 people is going to look no different to if they were infecting 6 people. So that's why it becomes a fallacy when you deal with a specific problem such as the Delta variant.
Right. Okay, I have gotten a great education from your LinkedIn profile. Thank you for being active on LinkedIn. I encourage everyone to follow the professor. I'll put his LinkedIn profile below. You've said something similar in some of your posts where you said, for example, I am a vaccine developer who's strongly against vaccine mandates. I don't believe I'm the only one in this position because, ironically, it is those who know the least about vaccine science who are most vocal supporters of mandates, claiming they will allow life to get back to normal, but they won't. So this is a big claim because we're being told they'll get us back to normal. You're saying they won't because they don't provide sterilizing immunity?
That's right. So we know in countries that are way ahead of Australia, that have 90% vaccination coverage, they're still having major outbreaks. The minute that they remove social isolation, they remove masks, they try to go back to normal. They've been hit with major waves of disease. Their hospitals are filled up. They start to see deaths again. So, again, it's not that Australia are discovering this sort of somehow we're unique to the rest of the world. Other countries are already there. And what they've realised is, even with exceptionally high vaccination rates, vaccination by itself will not be enough to make life go back to normal. And it's just an unfortunate fact. Now, if we have more effective vaccines, and of course, we, for one, are trying to develop a more effective vaccine, maybe vaccines would allow us to go back to normal. But I'm talking about the existing vaccines and what we know about the existing vaccines, which is that they don't give complete protection. The other major issue that isn't discussed is just how fast the protection wears off. We now recognise, from data with the mRNA vaccines, which have been used exclusively in Israel, we have very nice data showing after 4 months that any protection against actual infection is all gone. 4 months after having your 2 doses, which is why in Israel they've now given everyone a 3rd dose. Is that going to be enough? Well, it's too early to tell. But, that's extremely rapidly waning immunity. And that means those people 4 months after having had their mRNA vaccines, there is no effect that we know of on transmissibility, because if their rate of infection now is the same as people who are not vaccinated, and the level of virus when you test them when they're positive is the same as someone who hasn't been vaccinated.
Right.
On what basis are you arguing that in itself is going to allow life to get back to normal? It's not.
Well, aren't they arguing that it will mean less? So what part of the Today Show, sorry to bring up Dan Andrews so much, but the other day he said the thing is it's not about cases now. It's going to be about less hospitalizations and serious outcomes. So isn't that the case? You're saying, yes, there'll still be cases, but say in Israel, don't they have I haven't checked this data, don't they have a crashing hospitalization rate, which they would be correct?
Yeah. So as I said, now we're back to talking about individual benefit of the individuals that are vaccinated.
Yes.
They have a lower risk of hospitalization.
Yes.
So that's not in dispute. But now we're talking back about individual benefit.
Right.
So
and you're saying mandates are only valid for a community benefit, not an individual benefit.
Well, mandates are being justified by politicians for a community benefit, because you can't force an individual, as I mentioned before. It's against the Geneva Convention and all the principles we hold dear about informed consent. You cannot mandate that someone take a treatment that they, on a risk-benefit basis, believe they don't want. I mean, that, is beyond the law. So that's the disconnect we have here. If you're talking individual benefit, then the individual has a right to say, no, I want to take the risk, or no, I want the benefit of not being hospitalised. But mandates are only justified on the basis of some perceived community benefit, which is not apparent from the science. And so that's why I'm a pro-vaccine, but I wouldn't develop vaccines unless I was extremely pro.
Yes.
I am very much against mandates because I don't think they have a scientific or, in fact, a legal basis. And I think they're very damaging because they divide the community up, into a group who are happy to have the vaccine, whether it's mandated or not, a large group who ultimately feel compelled because they feel they've been given no choice, and so they do it against their will.
Yep.
I think a dreadful situation. And then those who very strongly believe that for whatever reason this is not the right thing to do, who are going to be victimised as a consequence. I mean, that's a terrible society we're talking about when you put it into the context in which it's operating.
Yeah, I'm particularly concerned about undermining the faith in all vaccines, because I've noticed a lot of people who are very highly vaccinated, like myself, up until this particular one, a lot of us are seeing some shenanigans happening in the vaccine world, and we're wondering how naughty has Pfizer been before this point. So maybe let's talk about some of the things you've raised on LinkedIn. You talked about CSL being disingenuous with recently their head coming out against some of this societal division. Can you please tell me about what they've been doing in terms of marginalising your work and not allowing others to use their manufacturing facilities and so on? What did you mean by that?
So, I've been very disappointed in CSL because they try to paint themselves as a good corporate citizen in Australia, and yet I think in truth their behaviour belies that. Last year we approached the government for support for developing our vaccine. It was the first vaccine in Australia to go into human trials. And so, we thought this is something the Australian government would embrace. The feedback we got was, well, you need to manufacture the vaccine in Australia, otherwise we're not interested. So we then approached CSL and had a discussion with CSL saying, this is the situation. Here we have, a promising vaccine. It's in the clinic, but the government are not going to support it unless we can access essentially your manufacturing capability. given that most of CSL's manufacturing capability in Australia is paid for by the Australian taxpayer, not by CSL, believe it or not.
Okay.
So all their infrastructure they use to generate their profitable drugs is paid for by the Australian taxpayer.
Right.
So we thought that they would say, yes, like everyone else, if you have a good candidate, we'll assist you, and potentially if you have funding, this is not for free. We would be paying for it. We'll give you access to our expertise and our facility. Instead, CSL said, no way, regardless of whether we have capacity or not, we have no interest in helping you. And, that was the end of the discussion.
Why would they be acting this way, in your opinion?
Well, you would have to ask CSL that. I mean, all I can do is repeat what was said, which is we have no interest in helping you. We have no intention to help you. And even if we had capacity, we would not give you access to our facility. I mean, we were stunned, but that was a very senior official speaking on behalf of CSL. And from that point, clearly the Australian government, have not supported us. And we believe that CSL have been actively lobbying the government not to support us, because I guess our assumption is because we potentially could become a competitor to CSL if our vaccine was successful here. And they don't want that to happen. And CSL do have a reputation for being a monopolist. I think the US Monopoly Commission actually did an investigation into CSL many years ago with regard to plasma products, and actually held that they were trying to take a monopolistic position globally on supply of those products. So this would not be the first time CSL have engaged in monopolistic behaviour. Right.
So, towards the end of our interview, we'll go into depth on the virtues of Covax and so on. But in terms of just the poor behaviour by some of these big pharma companies, I've heard it around for years on the outskirts of conversations that these big companies are just as bad as Raytheon and some of these defence contractors in the US. I'm discovering that through posts like yours, for example, when you talked about the myocarditis issue after the mRNA vaccines, what did you say? I don't understand what you're talking about, the COX-2 inhibitors and so on. But you are saying that these companies have a history of underreporting their shortcomings and somehow finding a way to get around liability.
Absolutely. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the thing that keeps big pharma companies honest ultimately is liability. So, if we look at some of the big class action lawsuits, for instance, the vaginal mesh companies, that cause problems in women with having vaginal repairs. Yes. They ended up paying out billions of dollars in compensation because of liability for what was found to be, essentially issues that the companies had covered up and had kept selling products even when they knew that those products were defective. And so there's a number of examples, and obviously that helps to keep the companies on track, because otherwise really what drives them is profit. I mean, they're private, companies, for-profit companies. They're keeping their shareholders, I guess, happy. But where it becomes a conflict between health and profit, if there isn't, someone holding them honest on that, inevitably the marketing people in those companies are going to say, let's squeeze a bit more profit out. Let's not, tell the market, this product has a small problem. Let's downplay it. Let's see if we can keep the money rolling in. So when you have a situation where, these large companies with new products, and new technologies demand that every country who wants access must sign a complete liability waiver, then, people have a right to ask why is that a demand, and is it a reasonable demand, and what does that mean in terms of what the company will now do if even a minor problem occurs. Will it be in their interests to maximize profit by just pushing on, or is there some force that will keep them honest? And the answer is, without that liability, you do run the risk that they will be dismissive of what would otherwise be issues that could see a product taken off the market. So now you're transferring all the responsibility to do that to the regulator, but as we've seen in the past, regulators aren't always able to police that, nor do it in a timely fashion. So I think it does change the context when you have a company selling tens of billions of dollars worth of product where there is absolutely no liability no matter what happens. That's an unusual situation, and one that you need to be very careful about.
Yes, well, you've described it as a perverse incentive where they would be incentivized to downplay issues rather than rigorously investigate them. Now, the last time I interviewed you, you mentioned that there is liability being given to these companies, but not to smaller ones like yourself. Is that still the case?
Yes. So well, I mean, we don't even have a purchase contract. So obviously,
but you would be denied liability, I assume, if.
Well, yeah. So it's a liability waiver. So it's not denying liability. It's actually it's removing all liability from the company and the government, assuming all liability.
Would you expect to get that?
It would be lovely for the government to offer us a contract for our vaccine in the first place, because that's where that liability waiver only occurs if you have a contract with the government. So if you were selling your vaccine privately, for instance, then no, it wouldn't be covered by any liability waiver.
I see. So the liability waiver is contained within the purchase contracts from the Australian government to CSL or whoever. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Which again, I would be happy to be honest, to stand behind my product. If my product has an issue, that creates a liability, like all companies, with the exception of what's happening right now, I should stand behind that product. If I'm saying it's safe, then it should be safe, or if not, then, I should accept that the liability that's consequent upon them. So in that context, I would be happy to stand behind my product. And so if the government did offer me a contract, would I insist, I won't sign the contract unless there's a liability waiver? No, I wouldn't necessarily go down that path. If they offered it, would I accept it? Well, I guess from a business perspective, you'd be silly not to. But in the case of these contracts, we know it was the companies that demanded those liability waivers. That's public knowledge. And the government then agreed and signed those liability waivers.
I don't know if you can answer this question, but do you know why the government and then by extension us, the public, accepted those demands from CSL and Pfizer and so on?
You would have to ask Minister Hunt and the Department of Health, officials who signed those contracts. I don't think the contracts themselves are even public. I mean, I know that some of the independent politicians have been trying to get access to those contracts, which in the public interest you would think should be disclosed. And the government have refused to provide access to them. So we don't even know what's in those contracts, other than they do all contain liability waivers as we understand it.
So, Professor, all of this behaviour by governments and these big companies smells a little bit to me in most normal everyday Aussies. Is this normal in your industry, or is it new in the recent 2 years and the recent 12 months with the COVID-19 vaccine?
So I think that no, there's always a bit of argy-bargy goes on whenever the government's negotiating contracts with companies. But we certainly, normally that's a public process, and most of the contracts are public documents, so they're public about. I mean, we've never seen I think a situation like this that's shrouded in so much secrecy, where the government's spending tens of billions of dollars and not telling us, what's in the contracts, what's the liability, in the short and long term, who's the money going to. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation, and we're talking about, literally enormous amounts of money with no scrutiny, no disclosure. Given it's taxpayers' money, I think as a taxpayer, we have a right to know what those deals are all about, what's in them, and who's getting the benefit of those deals. As I say, I think it's an outrageous situation where we don't have that information available.
Okay, and with your long history of working in this field, I find it interesting. You tell me it is extraordinary. This level of shrouded secrecy, this has not been what you've experienced over the past 30, 40 years.
That's correct. Yes. No, this has been particularly concerning, I think, because, if you want to protect the integrity of the system, then transparency, we all know, is the first rule to avoid, corruption, to avoid dishonesty, to avoid incompetence. The first thing is to have complete transparency over the process. And so I think, there's a right concern if there's a deliberate attempt to prevent transparency. What's motivating or driving that? Why is it they don't want us to know what's going on and as I say, what's behind these contracts?
So, Professor, your LinkedIn posts, I've noticed since our last interview about 6 months ago, I feel like they've been getting very, very helpful, but your posts are becoming more concerned about what these issues that we're talking about. I mean, the other day you said that there's never been a more important time for scientists and clinicians to hold their ground and not be afraid to speak out if they disagree or sense a wrong. Over the past 6 months that I've known you, have you been feeling a shift or a change in the way that people like yourself or others are trying to speak out on certain concerns and have a debate? What have you been seeing there? And am I detecting an increasing level of worry from you in your LinkedIn posts?
Absolutely. I mean, every day I'm getting, an increasingly bombarded with emails and phone calls from, people from medical practitioners, nurses, builders, labourers, you name it, from all around Australia, all fearful, all feeling that, their voice isn't being heard, that their rights are being trampled on, that they're being pressured to accept, vaccines, which they aren't comfortable to have, but feel that, basically they're being left with no choice. And I have to say, I mean, the analogy is, to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. It's the only comparable situation where the public felt, increasingly unable to say anything or do anything except to do what that government were telling them to do. And we know the ultimate consequence of that, where that ended up. And so it wasn't a process where overnight, the public were told to massacre parts of the population. It was a process over 10 years of removing rights and making people feel that they could only do what the government wanted them to do, and that if they didn't do that, they were going to be persecuted and their lives would be made miserable, to the point where they either capitulate or find themselves, exiled out of society. And that's exactly where, all of these hundreds of emails that I'm getting indicate people feel they're headed. They either have to capitulate and as they see it, harm themselves to stay in this society, or they have to become outcasts and obviously, give up their jobs and everything else. And I even have emails from people planning to flee the country, believe it or not, to escape what they see as persecution. I mean, it is quite troubling to be landed with that every day of the week, and there's nothing I can do about this. This is, really it's under the control of the government, and individuals increasingly are not even allowed a voice to raise the issue, which will guarantee that it won't be addressed. So it's a terrible situation to be put in. But unfortunately, that's where our government is headed.
So that's the individuals that are bombarding my inbox as well, saying, when is Nikolai coming out with his Covax? What about the colleagues, the people who you communicate with, I'm sure? How are they feeling? Are they feeling silenced at all? Or I don't know, where does the profession stand on all this?
Well, I think the profession's already gone silent, which is a disappointment to those of us who would hope that, the profession would, being an educated group who should be abreast of these issues, at least be prepared to discuss them internally. But again, all our professional bodies seem to have been convinced to toe the party line, and really have been very much just parroting whatever the government, are saying, have been parroted by all of our professional associations. So again, that is concerning, because we know some of what the government have been saying is misleading. Some of it's just totally incorrect. And someone needs to be, correcting those errors of communication, and where the government says, having a vaccine means you can't transmit the virus to other members of your community. That's a very dangerous and incorrect statement, because it means that vaccinated people, will go and visit their elderly relatives, not wear a mask, and may actually infect them, and they may die from that. I mean, so there are consequences when the government gives out incorrect information. Unfortunately, there can be, major negative consequences of that. And who's going to hold them to account? If the AMA are too scared to say, actually, what you're telling the public on through the media is incorrect, where can the public turn to get, correct information?
Do you have any information on, I don't know if you're the right person to ask about adverse events. I am only just starting to investigate whether we're hearing all of the full picture of adverse events. Do you have any light to shed on that? Do you have any knowledge? I think,
again, I can understand the government wanting to downplay adverse events.
Right.
Because, at this moment, they want to encourage vaccine uptake.
Right.
So they really want to downplay, rare adverse events that, some people may focus on.
Right.
But the problem becomes if the government start to pretend there is no such thing as adverse events, or that adverse events, your chance of having an adverse event is less than chance of winning Tats Lotto, which is a famous quote. It's been repeated on the official government media. That is not actually true.
Okay.
And so I take an exception whenever the government tell the public something that's completely false.
Right.
right? Doesn't matter how good their motives are for lying to the public.
Yes.
You're lying to the public. And that should never be acceptable in a Western democracy, for the government to deliberately lie to the public, no matter what the justification.
Right.
You know, and we see that happening. So I think the government, you know, if they're going to talk about side effects, they have to be honest. You know, if you're going to get myocarditis as a young man, and it's 1 in 5,000 young men that are going to get this problem, say it's 1 in 5,000.
Right.
Don't say it's lower than the chances of winning Tats Lotto, which is about 1 in 2.5 to 1 in 4 million, as I understand it. All right. So, if we're talking about, central venous thrombosis with the AstraZeneca vaccine, again, say, the risk is overall 1 in 100,000 to 1 in 200,000. But if you're a young woman, that risk may be as high as the regulators in Denmark said, 1 in 25,000.
Wow.
That is not the same or lower than the chances of winning Tats Lotto. It's outrageous. I mean, that's 100-fold out, in terms of probability. And yet we have very senior health bureaucrats getting up and telling these, what I would consider, they're certainly misleading statements. I would say lying to the public. And we have to stop that. We have to say, look, this is the probability.
Yes.
Whether it's 1 in 4,000. Now, that means 3,999 people are not going to have that particular side effect.
Great.
That is a better way than trying to fool people and say, these chances are less than the chance of winning Tats Lotto. So it's bad messaging, it's incorrect messaging. Yes, side effects are being downplayed. Now, does that mean everyone is going to get a side effect? Absolutely not. But we can't have individuals making risk-benefit decisions, which each individual should have a right to do. So when you're having an operation, your surgeon will tell you what the risks are that you'll die on the operating table. They must do that by law, or it's not informed consent. So if your surgeon doesn't tell you when you're having your varicose veins done that, there's a 1 in 5,000 chance that you could actually die as a result of this operation, right? You can sue them.
Right.
Under the law. And it's no different when the government is saying, have this vaccine. You have a right to know all of the side effects and exactly what their probability are. And then you have a right to make a decision whether you're prepared to accept those risks or not. It isn't the government's right to compel you to do something that could result in your death. It's the government saying, I want you to jump off this cliff, and you're breaking the law if you don't jump off the cliff. I think everyone would recognise that should never be allowed.
Right.
So whether the side effect of the vaccine is that you might die from central venous thrombosis is 1 in 500,000. If they mandate that vaccine, they are condemning 1 in 500,000 people who are being forced to have that vaccine to die. So that is not acceptable in any concept of a modern, free, democratic society. And yet that's where we are right now.
When you put it that way, I'm understanding why you're so angry about that. That is ridiculous. If they want to make the choice and then they end up dying, that's very different from the government killing someone. So I suspect, though, Professor, that even if you're right, it's going to take a few years for this kind of rational thinking to come back in vogue. So we're in for a rough couple of years. Can I ask you what the reality is about adverse events, not just with these vaccines, but you've worked in this for decades, with Covax, with other normal vaccines? What kind of rates do you normally expect to see with vaccines?
So most vaccines are being used for young children. we do have an increasing number of vaccines that are also used in adults, like, the herpes zoster vaccine, the flu vaccine. But overall, under normal circumstances, if a vaccine, was perceived to cause a death of, say, 1 in a million people vaccinated, then, it may get across the line, because probably that 1 in a million death is not a true death caused by the vaccine. But that's the level of proof that traditionally we've had to go to get a vaccine approved. They have to be, it's a bit like planes. Planes don't get certified to fly unless they can prove that it's less than 1 in a million chance that, the engine will fail. So with vaccines, it's always been the same principle. These have to be safer than safe, because you're going to be giving them to potentially 7 billion people. And so even a risk of 1 in a million, in 7 billion people is potentially going to cause 7,000 deaths. So it's all to do with the denominator and how many people you give vaccines to. So when people start dismissing, a vaccine that might cause a death in 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 200,000, under normal circumstances, that vaccine would never be approved.
Wow. And you just said a short time ago about Denmark, some of the official figures, you're talking 1 in 25,000. We're talking about much higher adverse rates.
Well, 1 in 25,000 young women having central venous thrombosis, not necessarily dying from it, because, again, with intensive care treatment, but they may be maimed by it. But yes, we're talking about a life-threatening side effect in 1 in 25,000 people, which is extremely high, which is why most countries then proceeded to actually ban the use of AstraZeneca in those populations that were at higher risk. And so we saw Scandinavia the first to say we're removing AstraZeneca, from people, say, I think they started under 30 and then it went to under 50, because the risks were perceived as too high relative to the benefit.
Right.
Because it's all a risk-benefit assessment at the end of the day.
Yes.
And so something that in an elderly person where they're at incredibly high risk of dying from COVID,
yes, you
might tolerate, quite a high adverse event profile.
Right.
Because you're balancing that up against, a 20% risk of death if they get COVID, in the over 80s, for instance.
Right.
And so you can justify a very high side effect ratio in that particular aged population.
Yep.
In a young person where their risks of dying from COVID are extremely small, now the risks, the same vaccine, the risks may be unacceptably high relative to the benefit in that particular person. And so that's why each person has to make the decision, not the government, as to whether they want that vaccine, because the risk is not the same for everyone, and the benefit is not the same for everyone.
So what are your views on, they're coming for my kid, I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. They're already pushing it lower and lower and lower. What are your views on vaccinating, like my kids, against COVID, 5 and 3?
So I think the issue is not whether ultimately children shouldn't be vaccinated against COVID, although their risks are very low relative to adults, but still some children, potentially can die just as they do from flu, or get serious illness, but it's a very, very low rate. But if we want to ultimately stop that happening, then definitely at some point in the future, I think we'll get to a situation where it will make sense to immunise young children. The issue is, are we at that point yet? And my answer would be no, mainly because, we're using technologies that, as I mentioned, have never been tested in large numbers of humans outside of the last 12 months. So we don't know ultimately the long-term safety of those products. What
would the point?
And so would I give an mRNA vaccine or an adenoviral vector vaccine if my children were 10 years old or 5 years old right now? As just absolutely not. I would say the risk of not knowing what the consequences may be, could it affect their development? Could there be some long-term issue emerge over the next 5 or 10 years, even if that's 0.01%? For my children, I would say that that's too high a risk. I would like to see the adult data over 5 years. Now, if the adults who've had it and over 5 years, we don't see any emerging signal of a chronic disease or some disorder that could be attributed to the vaccine, then I think at that stage you would start to say, okay, maybe that is safe to give to my children. So that's in respect of the new technologies. Now, obviously, we give our children inactivated flu vaccines, we give them recombinant protein hepatitis B vaccine at birth. Yeah. We know that they're extremely safe technologies. We've been doing it. In fact, we as children had those vaccines, and we're all doing okay. So I think that, when I say I wouldn't give my child one of these new vaccine technologies, not because there is a safety issue, but because we can't be certain about that. Yes. Would I be more comfortable to give them a vaccine, a COVID vaccine that's based on, recombinant protein or inactivated virus, very similar to what we're doing with flu and hepatitis B? Obviously, my level of comfort would be a lot greater in that context. So it is very much still technology-centric, the question about, how much data do we need before we accept that risk-benefit is sufficient. And so I don't think it's a simple answer of no, I wouldn't give any vaccine to my children. But would I give, what I considered to be still, a largely unproven vaccine in the context of children to a child? Then obviously I'm going to be, I'll need a lot more data before I'll make that decision. So it's not a no and it's not a yes. It's we need more data.
Okay, but given everything we're talking about, I with risk benefit, I struggle to see a strong benefit for me to vaccinate my 3-year-old against COVID. So I really can't see you or anyone else driving the risk profile down low enough to make me vaccinate my 3-year-old against COVID. I just don't understand that at all.
No, and that's again, it comes to the misperception or the miscommunication that your 3-year-old may be the vector who transmits COVID throughout the community. That may be true because children do have a habit of being vectors for influenza, for instance. But the problem becomes if the vaccine doesn't stop them transmitting the virus, then again, the whole argument falls down because, as you say, their individual risk from the disease is very low. If it would only be if you're arguing this will protect the whole community. But in the absence of evidence that vaccinating the children will stop them transmitting the virus if they get infected, then suddenly, again, you're left with no sort of argument in favour and a lot of arguments against at this point in time. So I think there's a lot of hype going on. There's a lot of, very proactive vaccine companies who are driving this clearly. Is it in the community's interests to embrace that sort of bravado? I don't believe so. I believe there's financial interest to many people to sort of encourage that behaviour. But, looking at it from the perspective of a community member, is this the best thing for me and my family? I simply can't endorse, that belief that this is a safe, reasonable, rational, and appropriate thing to do at this point in time with these particular vaccines.
Okay. We better get to why everyone's tuned in. They want to know what is going on with Covax. They want to know why it's potentially better than what we're seeing now. And I'd love to know where you see its response to different strains, its potential adverse reaction rate, the clinical trials you're currently running in Iran. So how about we start with Covax-19? Can you just give us a brief overview of why it's better, in your opinion, than what we're seeing today?
Yeah, so just to put it in perspective, back beginning of last year, we actually built a DNA vaccine, an mRNA vaccine, a protein vaccine. So again, we weren't, trying to say at that point proteins are best.
Right.
Although, the evidence of history is that proteins are the best, mainly because most of our vaccines that work and we know are incredibly safe are all protein-based. So not surprisingly, we tested them all and the protein won out in the animal models. And so we then committed all our resources to making a synthetic protein-based vaccine, as I say, very similar to the way the childhood vaccines are made for things like hepatitis B. Because what we believed is that safety comes first. Where, a lot of other people were pushing, we just need something that's effective. Safety, let's push that to the side.
Yeah.
And I guess that was the whole driver for mRNA, which came out of seemingly nowhere.
Yes.
Was because it was fast and it seemed to be working and safety was not a consideration.
Yes.
We took a much more conservative position, which, I guess, was a tough decision, which is we're going to put safety beyond everything else. And we think it will take longer because making synthetic proteins is quite challenging to get them right and to get them working. And yet we believe that investment of time would be beneficial in the longer term because we'd end up with something that was very safe and effective. And that's now the point at which we're at. So in terms of testing the vaccine, we've now done a large phase 3 clinical trial, which is the last phase. And that was in just under 17,000 individuals, of which, in fact, 3/4 got the active vaccine and 1/4 got placebo because we had to compare, obviously, the rates of disease in the two groups, but we wanted to give the maximum number of people possible in the trial the benefit of the vaccine. And so that trial has hit its primary endpoint. So it showed that it was highly effective against protecting people against the Delta variant of the virus, because that was the overwhelming virus that the people were exposed to during the clinical trial. So we have data that most of the other companies don't, because when they did their trials a year ago, there was no such thing as Delta.
Yes.
So when you see their headline results, which all look great and which they keep repeating,
96,
in fact, they're not relevant because, in fact, they have nothing to do with how well they protect against Delta, which we know is not nearly as good as those original results would have suggested.
So what can you
Yeah.
Can you explain before you go on when you say your vaccines were highly effective? Do you sterilizing immunity or at preventing hospitalizations or transmission or what?
Yeah. So in the nature of how these phase 3 trials are actually done, is that when people get symptoms, then they're tested for virus. And then if the virus assay shows up positive, then they clock up as a case of infection. So that could be a sniffle all the way to a hospitalisation. So initially when you look at it, it's just overall, how good is it at protecting against this particular infection? You can then break it down into categories, and we're still in the process of doing that. But what you'll know, even from the AstraZeneca and Pfizer trials, is that even with 30 or 40,000 people, the risk of someone actually dying, even at that size trial, is next to zero.
Right.
And so I remember a famous quote from our health minister, which is that AstraZeneca was 100% effective at preventing death.
I remember
and
that.
In truth, there was one death in the placebo group and no deaths in the AstraZeneca. So it was 1 versus 0.
Right.
Now, statistically, of course, it's a nonsense to claim that, you could make any assumption out of that as to what the level of protection against death was, but he was prepared to say it was 100%, which is statistically, as I say, completely flawed and misleading. So the reality in these phase 3 trials, no matter how big, is that you can, most of the cases are going to be mild to moderate disease.
Yes.
And so for the most part, you might see a small trend to reduced hospitalizations, but because they're so infrequent, even in the placebo arm, that none of these trials have been able to address those issues with any statistical significance. So the only thing you can really measure in the phase 3 is total number of infections.
Right.
Once you get approval, which we now have, and you roll your vaccine out and give it to millions of people, then of course you can start to see at the population level, how is that impacting now that we've given it to 1 million or 5 million people, how is that now translating into reduced hospitalizations, reduced deaths? But it's not possible to answer those questions from a phase 3 trial.
How does your phase 3 trial data compare to the phase 3 trial data we've been seeing from the established big players? Are you the same or better or worse?
I can't give you a headline number, because that's still confidential.
Sure.
I can tell you that it meets all of the criteria, whether set by WHO, the FDA, for approval of a vaccine. And this is criteria where we're actually showing direct protection against Delta, which, as I said, the other vaccines haven't done. In a placebo-controlled study. So we're one of the first to actually definitively show we're protecting against Delta. And as I say, we meet all of those benchmarks that have been set by those bodies for approval of a vaccine. And on the basis of that, we obviously now have an approval in Iran for the vaccine, which goes, by the way, just you have to realize in Iran, it goes under the trade name of Spikogen. So Covax-19 and Spikogen are the two names of the same product.
Okay, so you have approval and Covax is rolling out right now to potentially millions of people in Iran.
That's exactly right. So it's been approved. Obviously, there are negotiations going on at the moment in terms of a major rollout of that vaccine. But yes, that's exactly where we're at right now.
And where can we see, would we need to wait for data to come from Iran for you to convince other regulators, or do you think you'll be able to get some others on board in the next few months to 12 months?
No, so we're confident. I mean, as I say, it's some of the only data in the world definitively showing protection against Delta, variant. This is a phenomenal set of data, I can tell you that. Obviously, we'll be publishing it in due course. But no, so we believe that the data set as it stands should be sufficient to convince, regulators in countries that need a vaccine, that this is at least the equal, if not better, than any of the other current candidates out there. And so that of course is an individual discussion in each country with their regulator, and it's a process that you have to go through, with all the documentation to get approvals country by country. So unfortunately, it is a resource-intensive process to do that, but that's the process that with our partner in Iran we'll be embarking upon in coming weeks.
Wow, coming weeks. Okay, so are you confident that Covax-19 or whatever other name it'll be sold under will be approved in Western countries like Australia?
I'm confident it will be approved in other countries. I cannot comment on Australia for obvious reasons. That we've certainly reached out to the TGA.
Yeah.
But you have to remember the TGA is an arm of the Federal Department of Health, which is the same department that has provided no support for our vaccine throughout its development. So obviously that does make us nervous about the ability to make our vaccine available in Australia.
That's terrible. Any idea on why you guys have been singled out?
Well, I think we discussed the issue of CSL's monopoly.
Of course. Okay. So you think it's that
conversation, and remembering CSL, was spun out of the Department of Health. It used to be, So until the 1990s, CSL was wholly owned by the Department of Health, and then it was privatized, and not surprisingly, all the people associated with it got a large number of shares in that process. And so, if you talk about all the millionaires in Melbourne and Sydney who became millionaires thanks to holding large portfolios of CSL shares, and just where those people are and what positions they hold, maybe things will become very blindingly obvious as to why it's impossible for us to get traction in Australia for our vaccine as a competitor to CSL.
Thank you for making that connection for me. So your vaccine, Professor, is it a hobbled version, a dead version of COVID virus, of SARS-CoV-2? Is that how you've made it?
No, so it's a synthetic protein. So just like egg white is a protein, so this is a pure protein. So it's just the spike protein, which we actually produce synthetically. We use insect cells as our factory, so they grow in a broth, and they just produce the spike protein, not the virus, and we then purify the spike protein from the broth, and that then forms the basis of the vaccine.
So it's similar to, I guess, the mRNA vaccines are also trying to get a spike protein, but they don't inject you with a spike protein. They teach your cells. Well, you've called it a gene therapy. They therapize your genes to create the spike protein, right?
Well, so with an RNA or a DNA vaccine, you're injected with a gene.
Yeah.
And that gene gets inside your cells and instructs the cells to make that protein. But it's a gene therapy because what you're actually injecting is a gene. Yes. It's basically a set of instructions. Yes. And of course, we don't fully know the implications when that gene gets inside the cell. It's changing the cellular machinery just like a virus would. Now, we know when we get a virus infection, the virus gets in our cells and it screws with our cells. Yes. And a lot of those cells die or malfunction. Yes. And so when you give a gene therapy, it's basically doing the same thing as a virus. It's getting inside the cell and tricking the cell to now start programming and making a foreign protein, in this case, the spike protein. Now, what are the consequences of that is the big question, because now the spike protein is being made inside the cell and maybe affect the cellular machinery inside the cell. When we inject a synthetic spike protein, which is just a protein, it's outside the cells.
Okay.
So it doesn't affect any of your genes. It doesn't affect any of your cellular machinery. All that can happen is it can be recognized by the immune system. But otherwise, it's just an inert protein that, like all proteins, you're going to digest and break down, and basically your enzymes are going to eat the protein, just like if you ate a protein. So in that way, that's why protein-based vaccines, we know that they're very safe, because essentially we metabolize them. They don't affect our cells. They don't affect our cellular machinery.
So if your vaccine doesn't mess around with our cells as much, or at all, really, what you're saying, then your adverse event profile, as you've seen in your clinical trials, would be much lower, I would assume. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's absolutely what we're seeing. And not just us, but all of the protein-based vaccines that are in development. We're the first now in the world to get an approval, which is fabulous. First vaccine, COVID vaccine, developed in the Southern Hemisphere to get approved. Anywhere in the Southern Hemisphere. This is the first originated from our half of the world to get a phase 3 and to get approval. Needless to say, it's been a massive achievement. But, we also, recognise that there are other protein vaccines like Novavax's. Now, they haven't yet got approval, so we've beaten them to that, which, is always good. But we've always recognised they're also potentially a really good vaccine once they do get approval, because, again, you look at their published side effect data, you won't see any myocarditis, you won't see any central venous thrombosis, you won't see any myocardial infarction, you won't see any high fevers and people being off work for a week. Protein-based vaccines, people go back to work 10 minutes after having our vaccines and they're not going to be, feeling sick as a dog. And that's what our phase 3 data shows. It's what the published Novavax phase 3 data shows. Protein-based vaccines are the best vaccines for this problem. As I say, both on the side of their effectiveness, which we've just now proved. Novavax previously showed very good protection. On the side of side effects, again, they don't seem to share any of these side effects. And the only question is, why aren't these vaccines being made available? That's the question people have to ask. Why is it the government don't want them to have access to the best vaccines? It's as simple as that, because the science is black and white. And as I say, you don't have to believe us. Just look at Novavax's data. These are the vaccines that you would want to have.
Yes, you're selling it to me. I like it. Hey, just 2 technical questions. So adjuvants, just to clear up for everybody, you're not using aluminium or so on. You're using a plant starch protein or something simple? Yeah,
so it's a plant sugar.
Plant sugar.
So, yeah, it's called inulin. It's used in health. It's used in health foods as a dietary fibre. Yep. So it's very safe. In fact, it's been used for kidney tests for about 100 years, where they actually put it into your veins directly, like a kilogram of this stuff.
Yeah.
And then it comes out through your kidneys, and it does nothing to the human body. So it's completely inert. So a natural plant sugar, and then we have a synthetic small sugar component, which is called an oligonucleotide. Which just stimulates the immune system and works with the plant sugar to give you a really strong response to the spike protein. So,
and safety data on that nucleotide, I assume, is good.
Yeah.
What about strains? How is it possible for you to manage strains better than the others? And what about the next strains that are to come? Are you going to have boosters and waning immunity like the others?
Look, we can't. It's too early to say yet. Obviously, we have to roll the vaccine out and then see what happens. I mean, when we've used this technology to make other vaccines, and we've made a whole variety in the past, particularly against influenza, both seasonal flu but also pandemic flu. Then we've seen that the protection lasts for a long time, so it's quite durable. Now, what will happen with COVID? Every new virus, you can't make any assumptions. So we'll just have to wait and see how durable it is. The beauty is, if you need a booster, you're not going to get sick from the booster. So the benefit here is, if you do have to have boosters regularly, if you have a flu booster every year, for instance, people do that for 20 years and don't have a problem. Do we know if you can do that with mRNA? Well, the answer is it's never been done. So we don't know what the safety of having, regular boosters and whether the side effects might increase over time. We know if you've had an adenovirus vaccine, such as AstraZeneca, typically boosters don't actually work because you develop immunity against the virus itself that's being used in the vaccine, and so the vaccine stops working. So if you've had, for instance, the AstraZeneca, you're going to have to either switch to having a booster with our protein-based vaccine, which I would suggest would be the very best approach, or you'll have to have a booster with the mRNA because you typically cannot boost with the viral vector itself.
Well, given the adverse effects that we've discussed earlier, I think if people are going to do boosters forever and ever and ever, they should be jumping onto a protein vaccine. Sterilizing immunity, any word on that with your vaccine?
Look, sterilising immunity is a complex term because it depends what you mean. If it means there's not a single virus break through the barriers and, infect a cell in the body, there is actually no such thing as sterilising immunity. So it was a term from an age when we didn't have sensitive enough techniques to see if even just a few viruses had managed to get into a few cells, and then those cells get killed. It's not sterilising immunity because they did break through, but they never made you sick because they were killed so fast. Right. So if we say quasi-sterilising immunity, which is probably a more correct term, then yes, in the animal models, we see that there's no recoverable virus even day 2, day 3 after giving a large viral dose to the animals. We find that we can't find any recoverable virus, including in the nose. So it means that, and we've even done transmission studies where we've shown that we can vaccinate an animal, we can challenge it and make it infected with the virus, and then we can put another animal in the same cage. So it's rubbing noses with the vaccinated but challenged animal, and we've shown no transmission to the naive animal.
This is groundbreaking, Professor, because this is the concerns from people like Geert van den Bosch and Robert Malone about immune escape variants and viral immune pressures and so on. You've effectively solved that if this continues to play out that way.
Well, exactly. So, this is in hamsters, and so we're always, in fact, maybe it's to our detriment. I've always been very cautious in not overstating. Our competitors, you know them, the big companies, love to make all sorts of amazing claims for which, there's marginal evidence. So all I will say is that, we've seen this in hamsters. It's now been repeated. We've seen it more than once. Does that translate to something similar in humans? That is something that we're going to have to wait and see once the vaccine is actually rolled out, whether it is able to break that transmission cycle. If it is, then it's a complete game changer.
Absolutely.
Even if it doesn't, I believe that the protein-based vaccines, as they become available in themselves, are going to be game changers. But if we break transmission, then all bets are off. That's a blockbuster.
You'll be a billionaire.
Well, I doubt it. At this rate. We're essentially, in the process of giving it away because unfortunately our government obviously don't like to generate export revenues. They must think Australia's way too wealthy. Because as you say, you know, a successful vaccine, the only one in the Southern Hemisphere, in fact, to succeed, and the government don't want to make $1 worth of revenue out of it and want us to give it away free to other countries, which we are doing, is just astonishing and shows you just how deep this problem goes that we've been discussing.
It sounds corrupt to me, perhaps morally corrupt at least. Hey, last question before I let you go. How does your vaccine compare to natural immunity? And indeed, do you think natural immunity is something worth prizing? Is that quite strong?
Look, natural immunity is definitely stronger than the mRNA and the adeno vaccines. I can't say it's stronger than our vaccine because we at this stage we just don't have that data. So I'll be honest there, but certainly natural immunity is stronger than the vaccines. So for anyone who's been infected in the past, you know, demanding or making a mandate they get vaccinated is ridiculous because they're actually better protected than someone who's been vaccinated. So why are you forcing them against their will to get vaccinated? That makes no scientific sense. So certainly anyone who's been previously infected should be automatically qualified for a passport or whatever it is. I don't think we should have such things, but if you're going to go that way, someone who can show they've been infected, they have antibodies, shouldn't be required necessarily to have a vaccine unless they want it.
Right.
So I guess that's the first point in terms of natural infection. Should you seek natural infection to get immunity? Well, no, because to do so deliberately exposes you to all the risks of that infection, and that is not a logical choice.
Unless you're 10 years old. Unless you're 8 years old.
Well,
right?
even there, you know, children, as I mentioned, can get serious disease. They can die from COVID, you know, and you don't want it to be your child.
Yep.
You know, are you prepared to take a 1 in 10,000 risk? I would say not. So I don't think you would encourage anyone to seek natural infection. I think that's a flawed concept.
Okay.
But if you already have natural infection, because through no fault of your own you've already been infected, then you can be confident that you have a much higher level of protection than someone who's only had a vaccine. Of course, when we've given our vaccine in the clinical trials to people who have had a previous infection, their immunity has gone through the roof.
Oh, right.
So can someone who's been infected in the past benefit from a vaccine? Absolutely.
Right.
You know, they still have some risk of getting reinfected. You know, having a vaccine on top of infection does give you stronger immunity. So that is a logical choice, but you shouldn't be forced. That's what I'm saying. It's a logical choice, maybe to still have a vaccine if you've been infected, but you should never be forced to do it.
Yes. I'm getting that vibe from you, that you don't like mandates.
No, but I think it's about science should inform all of these decisions, and free will and informed consent. That's what we need, you know. So as I say, in terms of our vaccine, will it be better than natural infection? We'll have to wait and see. I think the answer is natural infection, just by its nature, will probably give stronger immunity than any of the vaccines, including the protein ones. But, you know, say you have our protein vaccine and now you get exposed to the virus, that will give you the best protection of all. And we see that, for instance, when in our animal models, if we vaccinate an animal against flu, now we give them flu, now they no longer die from the flu, you know, because they've been vaccinated. You can never, for the rest of that life of the animal, ever give them an infection with flu ever again. because they've had the vaccine immunity, which has given them, protection against, clinical disease.
Yes.
They can still get infected potentially with subclinical disease, but that then stimulates their immune system even more, so they can never be infected again, but they never got sick with the first dose of flu. So I think that's the other context of vaccines is, even a vaccine that doesn't give you sterilizing immunity may ultimately give you incredibly strong immunity, because, in the normal course of things, you may still get exposed to the virus. You won't get sick, but you'll get the benefits in terms of the boost to your immune system.
I'm feeling very helpful after this interview. Thank you for giving us so much. I've had you on for an hour and a half. Is there anything else you want to say to the many people watching? I can't tell you how many people are watching. You are one of the most anticipated guests that we have on. So anything else you wanted to say?
No, look, I think, people have a right to an opinion, and I think people have a right to choice when it comes to their body. And so, I just implore everyone to write to their politicians if they don't agree with them. I would implore them to vote against any politician who ignores them expressing their opinion or who doesn't respond to them, because that is the only way we keep the system honest. And so ultimately everyone out there, every viewer of yours, will determine what happens in the future, because they all cast a vote and they all need to make sure that their votes count. And the first thing to do is, if you write to, your local member and you don't get a satisfactory response, do not vote for them again on any account. Find someone else. And only by doing that will we have a vibrant, successful democracy and a free democracy, which I'm not sure we entirely have right now. I think we need to work much harder to protect the democracy that we think we have.
That's very well put. The one that we think we have. I would like to see us go back to that old principle we think we have called informed consent. At the moment, I can tell you right now in Melbourne, we have a lot of people getting jabbed. There's a lot who are not informed or consenting. Anyway, thank you so much for your wisdom, Professor. You've always got, as we grow bigger and bigger and bigger, you've always got a home here to have a chat. Always love to push along your wheelbarrow, as they say, because you're not getting enough attention in the mainstream. And my goodness, I can't get over the fact that they're not what CSL and everything are doing. So let's try and turn that around. Good luck with your work in other countries. Please let us know on your LinkedIn page when you get approvals in other countries. Then it sounds like for now, Australians should stop waiting to get Covax-19 here in Australia. We're going to have to go overseas to get it.
Well, hopefully not. I mean, we still hope in the integrity of, bodies like the TGA, that they are regulators. You hope that they think independently of our politicians and the Department of Health and will make appropriate decisions in the interests of the Australian population. So, no, I wouldn't give up hope. I'll tell you, if that sort of, confidence in the integrity of our systems is not there, but I'll be the first one booking a ticket out of Australia if that turns out to be the case, because I think there's no coming back from that.
Where are we going? Where would you go? Is there anywhere in the world that's doing this well, in your opinion?
Look, no, I mean, COVID has exposed how bad all of our systems are. I mean, ironically, China probably is that, as far as I'm aware, they haven't mandated vaccines. I mean, they obviously mandated lockdowns early on. They've kept the virus largely under control, but look, I think it's exposed all the warts across all systems. Russia is struggling. You look at all, the US is struggling. All the people who were normally the leaders are struggling terribly. And it's a really insightful into how bad our systems are, because pandemics are not, this is not the first pandemic And yet we seem to be rediscovering how bad our systems are to deal with pandemics. And yet, you know, we should have been much better prepared. And I suspect going into the next pandemic, it will be a shambles yet again, because somehow we don't seem capable of learning the lessons and putting in place systems, you know, based on the experience. So once, you know, the lockdowns end, life sort of goes back to normal, which I still think is still a way away. Everyone, including our politicians, you know, will move on to other priorities and sort of just dismiss the idea that we should be investing to the future, you know, pandemic proofing every country on the planet, because we're all linked. You know, that's what we should be talking about. How do we pandemic proof the world? And that's going to require whole systems. You know, we're going to need China to cooperate with the US and the rest of the Western world. I mean, we need whole new systems of governance, whole new systems of approving vaccines, developing vaccines, you know, so we don't end up with some countries having it all and countries like, or continents like Africa having nothing. I mean, you know, we have to do better, and we do have to work out how do we pandemic proof the world.
We should just elect Klaus Schwab then. That's what we need. We need a great reset. We need Klaus Schwab to be president of the world. That will solve all of our problems, I hear.
Okay, so
good night.
Great talking to you, and good night. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.